Hello and welcome to Inside Events, a new international contemporary podcast focused on the key issues in events studies. This week, I'm joined by Professor Richard Lapchick, one of my colleagues at the University of Central Florida, and we're going to be talking a little bit about the concept of social justice, particularly in the context of sporting events. Welcome, Richard. If you could give us a little bit about who you are, what's the organization that we work for, and why are you interested in social justice and have been for so many decades now?
I'm the president of something called the Institute for Sport and Social Justice. It's based at UCF. I just retired as the director of the DeVos Sport Business Management graduate program and the director of the Institute for Diversity and Ethics in Sport, which produces something called the Racial and Gender Report Card, which some of your listeners might be familiar with, trying to measure how many women and people of color are being hired across all the sports. So we do report cards on all the major sports, college sports, and the sports media. We do 12 reports a year there. But the interest in social justice really started because of my experiences at home. My dad signed the first black player in the history of the NBA in 1950. In fact, a movie was just made about it called Sweetwater. And my earliest memory as a child was looking outside my bedroom window in Yonkers, New York, where I was raised, and seeing his image swinging from a tree with people under the tree picketing and taking phone calls for the next several years that were directed at him with anti or racist epithets directed at him. And again, as a 5, 6, and 7-year-old, I didn't get anything other than a lot of people didn't like my father. But then I would later find out that it was because he had signed Sweetwater, and there were a lot of people unhappy with the NBA becoming integrated. So he was a Hall of Fame basketball player with the original Celtics. He was the first great big man in basketball. Everybody told me that I was going to follow in his footsteps. I loved that idea. Not that anybody saw any talent. They just knew mine had the same last name. But I was one of the tallest players in New York City in the 8th grade. My dad was, again, the first great big man, so everybody assumed I'd be 6'9" or 6'10". Your viewers can't tell, but I didn't quite make that height by about a foot. But I was heavily recruited in the 8th grade and was recruited by a school called Power Memorial, which was the top basketball program in the country. I didn't go there, but became friends with the coach. He invited me to his summer camp the next summer. There were 5 of his white players and his only black player there and me. And one of the white players was dropping the N-word on the black kid from dawn till dusk till I finally challenged him. He literally knocked me out cold. Well, the black guy's name at the time was Lou Alcindor. And Kareem Abdul-Jabbar and I have become lifelong friends to this day. But what was really important for me as a 15-year-old white kid was I suddenly had a young urban African-American lens to see what racism was doing in his community and other communities of color. And I decided, as a 15-year-old, not knowing what it would mean, that I would spend the rest of my life working in the area of civil rights. Ended up doing my doctoral dissertation in international race relations, and the subject of the dissertation was how South Africa used sport as part of its foreign policy and the international response, and compared it to how the Nazis had done that in the 30s. It eventually got published as a book. I started speaking about apartheid, founded the sports boycott of South Africa and the United States in the early 1970s. South Africa was being excluded from competition by all the European countries because of apartheid at this point. And I knew that eventually they'd have a team come here. And sure enough, in February of 1978, they had a Davis Cup team scheduled to come to America. I went down to try to build a protest against it and get the matches canceled. The African governments had asked me to announce they would boycott the 1984 LA Olympics if this team was allowed to come. I announced that at a press conference before my last speech of the weekend. NBC Nightly News was there covering it because of the implications for the Olympic Games in 1984. And Dick Schaap, who was a correspondent for NBC Nightly News at the time, the father of Jeremy Schaap, who's now a prominent ESPN journalist, came up to me and he said the financial backers of the Davis Cup had pulled out. It looked like the matches were going to be canceled. I announced that to the crowd. It was an anti-apartheid crowd. They went crazy. And when I flew home to Virginia that night, Mike, for the first time, I thought maybe I had done something worthwhile. Next night, I was working late in my college office, which was in the school's library. The library closed at 10:30, and at 10:45, there was a knock on the door. I just assumed it was going to be the campus security doing a routine check because they saw a light on in the office after the building was closed. So I didn't hesitate to open the door, but instead of campus security, it was two men wearing stocking masks who proceeded to cause liver damage, kidney damage, a hernia, concussion, carved the N-word in my stomach with a pair of office scissors. That night, lying in the hospital, Mike, I knew that if people had gone to the length they did to try to stop my father 28 years before, and to the length they went to try to stop me that night, they must have thought that our using the sports platform to address racism at the time was something that was being successful that they didn't want to see continue. So they went to the length they did. So I determined that if they would do that, that meant I had to spend the rest of my life using that sports platform to address social justice issues, especially race, but really more than just race.
That's fascinating, Richard. And obviously that's your driving force every time you wake up. That's the thing that kind of drives you every day. And I always think you're maybe more of an activist than an academic, or you balance the two quite well. Do you feel that there's more that could be done by academics to be more activist and to be more progressive and to push forward these social injustices in each person's kind of realm, I guess, of different social issues they want to progress?
I think people thought it was threatening to have athlete activism, both the athletes themselves, as well as people who might consider joining them because athletes weren't active themselves. And then suddenly, when the Milwaukee Bucks didn't come out during the NBA bubble 2 years ago because of a shooting that had taken place not just outside of Milwaukee in Kenosha, Wisconsin, the NBA didn't shut them down. They didn't penalize them or fine them. They, in fact, shut the whole playoffs off and shut down the league, and every other sport had followed suit in the next couple of days. I think since that time, athlete activism is popular. 75% of the American public now supports athlete activism. When Colin Kaepernick took a knee in 2016, just 4 years before that, I think most of the public disliked what he was doing. I think that's changed dramatically. So I think we're going to see more social justice. The NBA has created the Kareem Abdul-Jabbar Social Justice Champion Award that they pick a player from every team for the social justice things they're doing in their communities. And I'm on the committee that reviews them. And I can tell you that it's just so moving to see what all these athletes are doing now. Just in a short period of time, it's changed so dramatically.
And is that a trend that will continue, or do you see that in the future there might be some barriers towards progressiveness in that sense, or are we just now going to progress positively going forward, do you think?
I think these athletes who are overwhelmingly Black and wealthy are in a position that they can stand up and feel safe at this point. I think the climate in the country, depending on where you are, UCF sits in Florida, where the politics have, I believe, eroded and gone, back 20 years or 30 years. But that might change with the new governor coming in a couple of years. It's hard to tell. So, there are going to be bumps and grinds along the way. In our own institution, the state has said that you can't really talk about diversity anymore. So if you're going to talk about it, you have to kind of put it in a framework that will allow you to continue the teaching of it. But it's a critical time right now in Florida and in other states too.
So what are the things specifically in your teaching or in the research or the kind of activism advocacy work that you do that you feel like you can't do as much now because of the incursions into this speech?
Well, I have, people ask me if I'm on the DeSantis list, and I said if I wasn't on the list, it would mean I'm not doing my job. Yeah. So I have decided to, keep doing what I'm going to do. If people who are the activists stop doing what they're doing, then it'll stop. And that's not our goal, obviously.
Do you think something I think about, having to, be as open as we possibly can be? Something I find about American universities is that they have a very, very close relationship with industry and corporations, and therefore the social justice, diversity questions. It's not really that much part of the public consciousness of the university for the most part. I find that it's not something that's necessarily massively in our psyche as a Rosen College, for example. Even when you look at the executive board of the college, that's not made up of a very kind of diverse mix,
Right.
series of people that are pushing not only profit and an economic motive, but also social objectives. Is that a feeling that you get too, Rich?
I think that I definitely have that feeling in general, but one of the heartening things for me about the people who are supporting social justice in the corporate world is, we were trying to get the name of the Washington football team changed in this country, where some of us were, for literally decades. But after the murder of George Floyd, the three major corporate sponsors of that team said unless they change their name, they're no longer going to sponsor the team. And within 3 weeks, they announced they were changing the name. So that became a very powerful force. So if that can continue in corporate America, and that remains to be seen whether it will or not, as the racial reckoning probably isn't having as dramatic an impact right now as it did 2 years ago. But we just have to stay vigilant and continue to push.
The situation, I can imagine, in both the UK and USA, the situation economically, politically, is tumultuous in some sense, and people have a lot of basic level needs that need to be met before they consider these kind of broader, wider social justice issues as part of their everyday life. Do you think that the economic condition, the challenges that we face in America, are the things that are kind of diverting people's attention away from these social justice issues?
It can not only divert their attention, but it also can make you, if you come from an impoverished background and are kind of living day to day, the risk you might take by becoming more active in the political mainstream is jeopardizing your livelihood and ability to support your family. So I think that has to be factored in as we think about how to best do this to keep those people safe.
This is a really interesting point. I was watching. It's completely unrelated, but there is some link as to why America won't stop tipping, and it won't stop tipping because they have this kind of structure of the minimum wage and the sub minimum wage, and the people who are on sub minimum wage, they don't go to their employers out of being simply fearful that they might get fired. And so there's not that kind of grassroots change that's going to happen because of a slight kind of fear of that. I can just kind of imagine that's very, very similar, whether you take an organization or whether you take, doesn't matter what social issue it is.
That's a good analogy.
Like it just seems as that, this is just a very, very interesting power relationship between institutions and individuals. Which is quite interesting. And as a European, I've kind of come over and I've, it's useful to see it, the difference between the relationship, I guess, in some sense. And as a tenured faculty, I feel, even though that's slightly tenuous, tenure is tenuous, I guess, in some sense in Florida, given the political climate. But I do feel like it still is a bit of a duty to call out things wherever it's required. Do we call out, probably enough in universities? Do universities do enough, do you think, Rich, to try and push forward social justice?
I think they're doing more, but they're not doing enough. I mean, I think that there's a somewhat of a conservative element in parts of higher education in the country that if they were given more free rein which is now being restricted, to talk about these things in public and to challenge the powers that be, that then our academic friends would have an easier time staying in the game and challenging the system.
Completely. I think just thinking about sports, sporting events and human rights and social responsibilities, it's becoming an interesting economic argument as well as a social argument, whereby the very idea of hosting large-scale sports events are becoming synonymous with less sustainable forms of development, and that's resulting essentially in countries and cities and populations not wanting to host these things because they leave you worse off, and so therefore shifting the dial on social policy and rights and responsibilities in a more progressive sense seems like a clever way of overcoming the economic quandary as well as the social quandary. I guess in some sense, balancing the two is really, really important in some sense, isn't it?
Yeah, no, I think that's a really good way to look at it, an important thing to emphasize.
Yeah, it's interesting. So as a kind of concept, Rich, of social justice, I can just imagine maybe a first year student, first coming into contact with social justice, maybe a first year student, maybe a second or third year student, after they've learnt more of the functional operational things in terms of business, and then they get walloped with, oh, you can't quite do it exactly the way that we think because that might incur people's rights or some sort of social responsibilities, and we have to change the model. But for those students that are kind of coming into first kind of contact with the concept of social justice, how would you describe it and maybe unpack it for the people listening?
Well, we kind of the tone of the DeVos program fundamentally changed after Hurricane Katrina. We were doing social justice work with our students. Our students were required to do some form of community service for 20 hours a month while they're in the DeVos program. But then after Hurricane Katrina, I went down with the Magic 6 days after the storm. They flew into Baton Rouge where the first evacuees were being brought. And I was so moved by what I saw that I decided that I was going to try to create a program to bring our students down there. So between December of 2006 and the onset of COVID, we spent 58 weeks in New Orleans. By we, I mean myself and the DeVos students and faculty, worked on more than 155 homes. And I think when at the end of that first week, you can imagine New Orleans in August, it's very hot. You're sweating a lot. You're rubbing shoulder to shoulder inside tight spaces, rebuilding homes. So that by the time you get into that first class on Monday, it's not, hi, Mike, my name is Rich. You would have worked shoulder to shoulder with me, sweated together, seen the incredible scenario of how it happened, that the city of New Orleans did not give any help to the lower Ninth Ward, which was where the majority of the African-American people live, because they wanted to change it from a majority African-American city into a minority African-American city, which they were very successful at doing, and that's the case now. So the students learn about the injustice. They're taking part in doing something about it by help rebuilding the homes, and they kind of hit the ground in those first classes, just far different than 20 students coming together from different parts of the country or world that had never met before that Monday.
So to kind of truly understand the concepts of social injustice, you have to just kind of live and breathe it and see it within its context, and it's so case sensitive, I guess, in some sense. Is that what you mean?
It really helps if you can see it up front and you can relate to that possibility happening to you as well. It's just by the grace of whoever you think it might be that you're able to be, in graduate school, thriving pretty much in America, because there are so many people who aren't.
Mm-hmm. I think if you kind of think about how you've interacted with students about social injustice, do you find that there's a huge amount of appetite from students nowadays who are studying, for example, a sports degree to take seriously the social injustice issues and try and find workarounds and ways through it, and to try and tackle structural barriers? And do you find that there's a huge appetite from the students for that?
Well, there is for those who come to our program, Mike, because they're applying to our program largely because of how we've differentiated ourselves by being this activist group. I mean, our students staged the Community Rainbow Run for the One Pulse Foundation and have raised over $4 million for the One Pulse Foundation by literally start to finish organizing those events themselves, getting the corporate sponsors, working with the track people to get the city lined up so they could have these things. So those are, real life experiences where they're meeting the families of the victims of the Pulse nightclub shooting, where, when we're in New Orleans, we're bringing home literally people who couldn't come home because their homes were unlivable. So our students have that appetite. I think when they talk to other students around the country, they like what they hear and would love that to be implemented more in their programs. And I think there is a more of a service aspect to a lot of the graduate programs now that is, hopeful that what the students leave after 2 years or however many years the graduate program is, thinking this service was really meaningful. I'm going to continue doing that during my career. Then we'll have accomplished something really important.
You definitely see, on that point, you definitely see increasing critical studies and critical theory being brought into, even though it's despite the challenges in Florida, we still definitely, we might package it in a slightly different way, but the meaning is still there, which is, there's a huge amount of people, whether it's disabled people with disabilities engaging productively in the visitor economy, or whether the sorts of services are put in place for people in hotels and restaurants in order to participate fully, right through to the way in which major sports events, so we're working with It's a Penalty as one of our partners to use major sports events through working with Southwest Airlines, to Airbnb, to Uber cabs, to raise awareness of the signs of trafficking in real time. So we might be able to overcome some of these issues and report them in real time and work out what maybe technologies are required in order to alert authorities and police right there. And then whether you're a Hilton member of staff or whether it's an Uber cab, these people play such an important role. So I think, universities are playing a great role, need to do a lot better. We need to integrate it a lot more and have that as a real kind of selling point, I guess, for the university program. But instead of it being more, I guess, ad hoc. But that's interesting. So in terms of, Rich, I won't take too much more of your time, but in terms of where we think that the idea of social justice is going, the idea, maybe some of the work that you're doing, what are the kind of future trends that we should really be looking out for, I guess?
Well, for me, I like to try to offer a variety of opportunities for the people we're trying to get involved. It just doesn't have to be about human trafficking or racism or sexism. There's so many social justice issues out there, sexual assault and child abuse, and just the list could go on, that I encourage people to pick one of those social justice issues, read more about it, maybe volunteer for an organization in their community that's doing something about it, and see if that feels good and an issue they want to continue to work on throughout their lives. Because, as I said, there's so many issues out there that need attention, that if we could spread our students out and encourage them and the professors who are involved with them to get involved in those service aspects of something that's important to them, then they're more likely to stay with it throughout their lifetime.
That's great. That's great advice. And, just from, again, coming over the pond and seeing what, how many charities, NGOs are out there doing great stuff with social justice issues. There's a lot of people in the, in the fight in the different ways. So, Rich, we'll wrap it up there. We could talk for hours really about this and the detail of the various different issues. So hopefully we can have you on again in the future to talk maybe about some of the really specific issues. But I think that gives a really useful overview in terms of social justice and how people get involved and maybe pursue this as a line of inquiry for themselves, I guess. So thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you for having me and exposing some of these ideas to your listeners.
Thanks, Rich.
All right.